Good morning and welcome to the attic. For some reason I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning and 2 hours later I'm ready to go back to bed. Not too impressed with that. I wish it were a nice sunny morning, but a lot of cloud cover has arrived with the sunrise, so I'm not heading out into the forest too deeply this morning with the dog when we finally head out. But a few days ago was just phenomenal. I saw the forecast from the night before that the skies were going to be clear. Grabbed the dog, drove 20 minutes to a part of the forest that I've not photographed before and just had the most amazing morning. The heather is just at the end of its bloom at the moment, so the colours are fading just a little bit, but I've not seen so much heather and with such bright colours as this year. I don't know what it is about the weather that's just made the heather go crazy this year, but we had an amazing morning on Wednesday morning. Oh, and the other fun thing that happened was that day before I got up, sat down in front of my computer, drinking my cup of tea, first thing in the morning, looked out of the window and saw that the cat was stuck on the neighbour's roof. So that was fun. So today's video is about how I set up my camera for photographing unconventional sporting events. If you know the channel, you know I photograph a lot of climbing and I photograph a lot of parkour. A lot of my work involves trekking around Europe and documenting various parkour events, usually in Denmark and Italy and maybe in Serbia, Croatia and in the UK. But obviously coronavirus has put an end to that. But earlier this month, I spent a week at the International Gathering in Denmark. So on the back of that, I thought I would give some tips on how I set up my camera for these sorts of events. It's kind of different between parkour and climbing, because obviously with parkour, everything can move quite quickly, whereas in climbing, it's much more static and you get a bit more time and your shutter speed doesn't need to be as high. So starting off, I'm shooting on the Sony a7 III, which I still have no idea when I would ever need to upgrade, because for the action that I shoot, 10 frames per second is brilliant. The autofocus is amazing. And I mean, yeah, it'd be nice to have the subject tracking that's now available in the A7C and some of the A6000 models that they've kind of upgraded. But to be honest, I rarely track a moving subject, so it doesn't bother me too much, but I'll come on to autofocus and focusing systems a little bit later on. So on my A7 III, I take advantage of the 2 memory recall slots, and they allow me to switch between 2 modes of shooting really quickly. And since moving from my Canon 6D, that's the original, over to Sony, which was a couple of years ago now, I've completely changed the way I shoot, actually. So when I was shooting with my Canon, for whatever reason, I shot fully manual and I was constantly having to check my exposure, take test shots, keep looking at my histogram afterwards. Moving to Sony, I'm now reliant on 2 things which have completely changed the way I shoot. The first is auto ISO. So I'm in manual mode. I set my shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second to capture the fast moving action. I shoot at f5 or f5.6 to give myself plenty of depth of field, because I'm often shooting in quite an architectural style and it's nice to have the focus from front to back. And I leave the ISO set to automatic, and this means that the camera makes a pretty intelligent decision most of the time. Even looking straight up into the sky, it's rare that I'm underexposed and losing detail in the shadows. It's pretty intelligent in that sense. I'm also shooting silently because a lot of what I'm photographing, I'm quite close to the action a lot of the time, and I don't want to disturb necessarily what people are doing, because they might be doing something that requires a lot of focus or is slightly dangerous, and they don't need me intruding any more than I already am. Silent shutter can have some strange effects on photographing action. So if you're photographing someone swinging a golf club, you'll see this nice curve in the golf club if you shoot it with a electronic shutter, fully electronic shutter. A mechanical shutter is far preferable under those circumstances. As sensors improve, that will become less and less of a problem. However, with a moving body, it's rarely moving so fast that you're starting to stretch things out. And also the body moves in relation to itself. It's not like with a golf club where part of the golf club is relatively still and then the end of the golf club is moving incredibly fast. And it's this difference that creates that bowing effect. With the moving body, it's not so much of a problem. You have to keep an eye out for it occasionally and it can have an effect, but it's very rare, and usually silent shutter is not a problem. If I do worry about it, I've got a shortcut set up in my function menu, a couple of clicks, and I've switched my mechanical shutter back on. Oh yeah, so if the exposure isn't looking right, and I've always got my histogram up in the corner of my screen as I'm shooting, keeping half an eye on that, making sure that the camera isn't doing anything weird. But if I am overexposed or underexposed, I just make a small change to the exposure compensation dial, and then you've just got to remember to change it back. And that's another reason to have the histogram constantly showing, because if you tweak your exposure compensation, get involved in what you're photographing, and then forget to change it back, you can then shoot for the next hour or something completely at the wrong exposure. Because I'm in manual mode, I've got the shutter speed under my finger, I've got the aperture under my thumb. It's rare that I'll change the aperture while I'm photographing with my wide-angle lens. As I say, I like having focus pretty deep, and it means you've got fewer out-of-focus shots as well. And then the shutter speed, typically I'm set at 1,000th of a second, which is usually more than fast enough. But if a body is moving particularly fast, or if you're very close to the action, it's worth bumping it up just a little bit, maybe to 1,600th or even 2,000th of a second. Kind of depends on what's happening, and also light levels as well. I'm not too afraid about letting the auto ISO crank all the way up if necessary. I would rather have grainy, sharp images than clean, blurry images. So in some cameras, certainly I think on mine, you can set, as well as the minimum shutter speed when you're playing with auto ISO, you can also set the maximum ISO that it'll go to before it starts changing other variables. Obviously in manual mode that's not going to happen, but in things like shutter priority and aperture priority mode, that can be useful. But like I say, I don't worry. If the ISO needs to go high, then the ISO needs to go high. So the other thing that's been a bit of a game changer is the other mode that I shoot in, and that is aperture priority, but with auto ISO and a minimum shutter speed. So when I'm out photographing parkour, my first mode is set for my wide-angle lens and all of the fast-moving action. And then the other mode that I'm shooting in is this aperture priority. Minimum shutter speed is set to 1/250th of a second, and the auto ISO is switched on as well. And typically I'm shooting on an 85mm lens. The aperture is set wide open, so I'm getting loads of shallow depth of field. And this is really good for capturing little moments of focus and getting tight in on the action, little details as well. So you get this nice blurred background, and yeah, you get a chance to separate your subject. And if it's a busy environment, or if the architecture, the environment's not that pleasing, it's also useful to be able to get in a little bit tighter and also grab a bit more of the emotion. Very often when I started out shooting parkour and parkour training events and climbing events, it was about setting the athlete in context and getting often, shooting between 16 and 20 millimeters for the entire day. And I realized that I was actually missing out on a lot of the emotional processes that people were experiencing. And I found that, obviously a longer lens, isolating the action, isolating their emotions is a way of being able to give a more intimate insight into what's happening. If when I'm in this mode, I decide to start shooting action, which doesn't happen too often, I tend to shoot most of my action with the wide angle zoom, but if I'm shooting action with the telephoto lens, I will maintain that wide open aperture. But obviously you've got to keep an eye on your shutter speed. So the minimum shutter set at 250th of a second is not going to be adequate for a lot of what happens at a parkour training event. So for that, I've got two options. I can stay in my mode suitable for the telephoto lens with aperture priority, and I've got a button set up so that I can change the minimum shutter speed, and I'll just bump it up to 1,000th or 1,600th of a second. The better option is to switch back to the other mode that I've usually got set up for the wide angle zoom. So that's manual mode with the 1,000th of a second, and my default is to have the aperture set to f5 or f5.6, and then I literally just roll the thumb and turn the aperture down to wide open, and suddenly I've got the fast action with the shallow depth of field ready to go. Focusing is a bit of a funny one for me, and I think a lot of professionals will do this completely differently. But for years, I shot with the Canon 6D, and this is the Mark I Classic, whatever you want to call it. This was the first iteration of the Canon 6D. And this camera only had one good focusing point. It was a cross-focus focusing point right in the middle of the frame. So you could choose, I don't know how many other focusing points, but they weren't necessarily as accurate as this one that was in the middle of the frame. So for that reason, I was very used to focus and then recompose. And that's something I've carried through to shooting mirrorless, which will sound a bit ridiculous. But what you have to consider also is that with parkour and with climbing, You know exactly where an athlete is going to be, so I can focus and recompose before they've even started moving. I know where an athlete is going to be when I want to capture the shot. So 99% of the time, I will pre-focus. And this is useful as well because you can't rely necessarily on the camera's autofocus tracking it. Yeah, they are wonderful machines and they will make a lot of intelligent decisions. But if an athlete suddenly pops into your frame, which can happen quite often if you're positioning yourself low, the camera doesn't get time to react. Or there might be something else happening between you and the action that's going to grab the camera's attention and completely ruin your shot. So I tend to get more keepers if I pre-focus, and yeah, I still focus and recompose. I will use the joystick to move the focus point around occasionally, but a lot of the time, yeah, still focus and recompose. So when I'm photographing action, if I know where the athlete is going to be, I'll often use something in the frame, in the environment that I know is about the same distance away as the action is going to be, and take focus from that and then recompose my shot and then wait for the action to happen. When shooting on the telephoto lens, it's very different. So I will use eye autofocus, especially for portraits, and eye autofocus has just been absolutely amazing. And I've also got another button mapped to switch away the autofocus from single point autofocus to wide area autofocus, and I just let the camera make its best decisions. It can be a bit hit and miss, especially if stuff is close to you, especially if I'm using a third party telephoto, so the autofocus isn't necessarily the fastest. And the camera will occasionally make bad decisions as well, but it's a good combination. So that combination of the single point autofocus, eye autofocus, and then being able to just hold down a button to switch the camera to wide area autofocus tends to be the best combination that I've found so far. So that's it for now. I'll make another video discussing gear, and then maybe the same video or another video talking about how I approach the day, the little tactics that I use to make sure I get shots, and the differences in approach between climbing and parkour and people jumping into the sea. So stay tuned for that. Just to mention, I am in conversation with internationally acclaimed climbing photographer Lena Drapella. I'm interviewing her for the Women's Bouldering Festival live on Zoom on the 13th of September. You can buy tickets for that. I think they cost about €12, $14. And that gives you access to a total of 12 online talks as part of the online program for this year's Women's Bouldering Festival. So head to womensbouldering.com and grab yourself a ticket, and hopefully I will see you there. Until next time. Bye, I guess. Yeah, until next time. And then I just stopped.